Did you ever consider going to study post-baccalaureate in French?
Yes, I wanted it, but as I said, I sensed that the French were fading, so I switched fast.
So you switched to English in 1955?
English, yes, fast.
So tell us, how did you do that?
Apparently, the Americans and the Philippines knew that there was a vacuum in Indochina. The Philippines started to offer scholarship to Vietnamese students to go to the Philippines. I took one of the scholarship, and since I could not afford a plane ticket, I had to hitchhike with the South Vietnamese Air Force, and it was quite an adventure. The South Vietnamese Air Force was given by the Americans World War II vintage one propeller plane. It was a tiny plane. Before I boarded the plane, no, I must go back. The Vietnamese could not do any maintenance on their own plane. So at the end of how many thousands of flying hours, our pilots must fly the plane to Clark Air Base, American Air Base in the Philippines for maintenance. So I hitchhiked one of those planes. That means the plane was ready to crash anytime at the end of its life.
Terrible.
So I had to sign a paper promising that my family will not sue the Air Force if the plane crashed. It was quite an adventure.
Yes.
So when from the Manila airport, I looked back and I saw that tiny plane on the runway. The plane was so tiny that there was room for the pilot, and in the back of the pilot there was room for a navigator and a tiny space for myself, the hitchhiker. Yeah, I survived.
Brave, you were brave. Yeah.
Also, the Navy, the Vietnamese could not do maintenance on their boats, their ships, given by the Americans out of mothball. So the Vietnamese had to sail to Subic Bay, the huge American naval base in the Philippines, for maintenance. Yes, I visited Subic Bay too.
So while you were studying English in Manila, you had some contact with the American Embassy.
Yes, I needed money. I was given 100 pesos a month. It was enough for a student, but I wanted more money, so I applied and found a job with the embassy in Manila, and that was a discovery. I discovered the Foreign Service. That was my first taste of the Foreign Service. Oh yes, this is what an embassy does in a foreign country. Oh, I liked it. I must join the Foreign Service.
Because before that, you'd been thinking about teaching French in the lycée or university.
Yes. Before that first stage of the Foreign Service, I wanted to be a French language teacher in a lycée or in a faculté. But I changed my mind on the spot when I set foot in the embassy.
service?
From Manila, I had enough money to buy a ticket and boarded a French, again the same French boat that carried my father to France, the Cambodia. It was my first cruise, although it was not a cruise ship, but my first cruise. And I went back to the University of Saigon. I majored in French linguistics and my minor was history. And I had good professors. Most of them were French. The best were the Jesuit priests deported from China. The communists didn't want them in China. So the Jesuits came to Vietnam and taught school in Vietnam. And two of them were the best. One was French, and the other one was Canadian, French Canadian. Yeah.
Were you raised Catholic?
I was Catholic, but actually I am a free thinker. That means I am a non-believer, maybe, or an atheist, maybe. I am just a free thinker.
And how about your parents?
My parents were like me. My father was open. We were, in my family, we were Buddhist, Catholic, Baptist, Jewish. Nobody cares. We are open-minded, and nobody quarrel.
Are you talking about your family here in America now, or your family back then?
Both back then and here. Yeah, yeah. My wife is Buddhist. We don't care. We never quarrel. We worship the same God. There is only one God. There are different ways to worship God. Why quarrel about the way to worship God?
Well, while you were studying at the University of Saigon, you also started working at the Vietnam Press Agency. And what were you doing then?
I was first a translator. Then I was promoted to reporter, and then I was promoted again to editor, all in the French language section. There were 3 sections, Vietnamese, French, and English in Vietnam Press Agency.
And then a little later, from 64 to 65, you worked as a press officer, but in the Prime Minister's office?
Yes. The Prime Minister's office needed a press officer, and it was already a tradition to borrow professionals from the agencies. In this case, a professional journalist like me from Vietnam Press. So I was drafted. I did not apply. I didn't know that I was drafted by the Prime Minister's office. Suddenly I received an order, report for duty, Prime Minister's office on such a date. That's all. That was the way in our administration. We were promoted without applying, in spite of our political allegiance or anything. They didn't care. If we are good, we are drafted to be director of something. I became director 3 times. being drafted.
Mm-hmm. Were you surprised that you
I
were
was
chosen?
surprised, yes, totally surprised. And that was the way in Vietnam, meritocracy.
Mm-hmm.
So I became chief. I was, I think, 24, 25, 25, I think. Chief of the Bureau of Translation, Reduction, and Research, doing research for the Prime Minister, especially. For instance, when the Prime Minister was going to greet a foreign visitor, a Prime Minister or somebody, I must do research to tell the Prime Minister who that foreign VIP was, to brief the Prime Minister in advance and to do research, for instance, background documentation for the Prime Minister, or writing letters that the Prime Minister never looked at, like greetings to a foreign Prime Minister, his equivalent, not to the President, but a foreign Prime Minister on a national holiday of that country. The Prime Minister never see that telegram that we sent to that foreign Prime Minister. I wrote it, either in French or in English. I wrote it.
So you must have had a lot of contact with the prime ministers in that period.
Yes and no. I tried my best not to be too much in contact, not to be identified with any political faction or party or clique or group or whatever, or a gang, even a gang. There was a bandit gang, the Bin Suin, that run the police. That's why I mentioned gang. I didn't want to be near any of them. There were prime ministers and prime ministers. They came and went. I didn't care.
So you were only there for about a year, but
A year.
How many prime ministers came and went?
There was a series of coup d'etat. Each coup d'etat put on a new prime minister for a few months.
Were they violent? Were the prime ministers were murdered?
No, fortunately, beginning with the first prime minister, my own cousin, a doctor. As I said, the family on my paternal grandparents were better educated, so he was the first doctor in the family, and he was a French prime minister in the French puppet Vietnamese government. And after that cousin, others of my cousins were ministers, cabinet ministers. I remember a minister of the interior, another Lê Quang, a minister of economy, another Lê Quang. So that was the production of my grandparents. They succeeded. On my maternal grandparents, they were less educated. And as we said, in the family, if you don't have an education, you might become a general. And it was true. I remember two cousins who became generals. One of the generals was the mayor of Saigon, my cousin. Another general was a fellow refugee on a refugee ship with me. So I remember those two generals, my cousins.
So, but right before you started in that office, there was a bloody coup d'etat.
That was against Ngo Dinh, and I had to cover all the bloody events. And with the blessing of President Kennedy, Ngo Dinh was murdered. I would say murdered, not assassinated, because he was captured by the army. He was tortured. He was disemboweled alive before being shot in the head in a army troop carrier. Yes, and I was still with the Vietnam Press Agency, and there was a riot. A mob attacked Vietnam Press Agency and had to run for my life because I was on the wrong side.
But you didn't personally like the end.
No, I started to dislike him or to be very uncomfortable with him, because when the movie theaters in Vietnam had to project his image on the screen and played a song praising Ngo Dinh, it made me think of the time I had to sing praise to Marshal Pétain, the renegade French president under Nazi Germany. So now from then on, I was against Ngo Dinh, but I was a civil servant. I didn't care. I kept quiet. I went home. I didn't care. I decided to join the Foreign Service when I was 19 years old. I was learning English in the Philippines, and I got a part-time job at the Vietnamese Embassy in Manila, and I started immediately to like the Foreign Service. That's why I waited and waited for the opportunity to take the first Foreign Service examination, and it came when I was working as a press officer at the Prime Minister's office. I took the Foreign Service in great anticipation for my future, because it was the first time the Foreign Ministry recruited career Foreign Service officers, and I know that the exam would be very, very tough, since Vietnamese was not a diplomatic language. Candidates must take the exam in either French or English in order to compete or to beat the competition. I took the exam in both French and English. I did the written part in French and the oral part in English, and I passed it the first try, and I wonder why I passed it, because I know that many of my competitors, or most, or even all of them, were recommended by top brass in the governments, by journals, by VIPs, all kinds of VIPs. I was all by myself, no sponsorship, no nothing. So, but I passed the exam, and now I got into a dilemma since I was also in graduate school, both in the Faculty of Letters or Humanities and the Faculty of Law. Sorry, I was speaking French. Faculty of Law. So I must join the Foreign Service immediately and drop my studies, or I must postpone joining the Foreign Service and take care of my studies and join the Foreign Service later. I found out that no, it was not possible. If I don't join this year, next year I must take the exam again. I am not going to take that risk. It was too tough. So I dropped everything and joined the Foreign Service immediately and start training, uh, both on the job and at the diplomatic service center in Saigon.
Mm. So after a year of training, you were posted to Washington, D.C. for your first tour. Was that unusual?
It was a miracle, without any affiliation with any political party or group or clique or gang. I repeat, gang, because there was a bandit gang that runs the police. All by myself, suddenly I received the order to go to Washington, D.C. And I couldn't believe it, but it was real. So I ran home and said goodbye to my parents.
So you were in Washington, D.C. from 1966 until early 68.
Right.
That's right. And how would you say your time at the embassy in Washington changed you?
It was a big change, but it was also quite easy. First, I was already thoroughly westernized. So suddenly I found myself in an English speaking country instead of a French speaking country. I switched fast, and the differences, I would say, with a plural, were subtle. Just switching from one language to another language, it was easy. And switching from a culture to another culture that were related, French culture, American culture, it was related. And so it was again easy for me. And then I lived in a safe neighborhood in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. That was Kensington, Maryland. It was middle class. I had educated neighbors, good neighbors, well behaved neighbors. I had no trouble. I just blended in, although there were not many Asians around. Not that time, not then. But I blended in because I spoke English already. And it really changed me from then on. I know that I belong to the Foreign Service, not particular to America, but to the whole world, because that was my ambition. The whole world must be open to me.
Mm. Well, in February of 1968, the communists launched the Tet Offensive, and you were recalled to Saigon. Why?
The defense ministry got panicky, and the ministry recalled all the draft age diplomats from around the world to go back to serve as officers in the Army, Navy, Air Force. And I remember one day I watched TV in the rec room of Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington D.C. Along with my classmates, I watched the Marines fight to retake the imperial city Hue in central Vietnam. The following day, I received a cable from the defense ministry, go home for active duty. So the clerk in the embassy tried to book a flight for me back home to Saigon right away. And she was told that no, there was no flight available to Saigon because Saigon was under attack. But I decided to go. I must go because I didn't want to desert the army or defect from my country. And I had some talk with my older colleagues. Some decided to remain where they were in France, in Canada, and I disagree with them. I must go home. It was that simple because the risk was not not more than I expected. I could die in a car crash in the States, or I can die in Vietnam. That, so what? And many more people died in car crashes in the United States than dying in Vietnam in the war. So I would be relatively safer in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then it was also a moral problem. Yes, how can I live with myself if I deserted the army, or if I left Vietnam? I don't want to be a coward.
Mm. Can you describe what it was like returning to Saigon shortly after the Tet Offensive?
Yes, it was a big shock. As soon as the airline said a flight was available to Saigon, and this I must specify that it was a commercial flight. Military flights were continuing all the way during the offensive, but the first commercial flight was available. So I took that flight, and it was a big shock when I landed in Saigon. The airport was in ruin, and there were soldiers everywhere, and waiting for me was my brother-in-law. He was armed to the teeth. He was then a army major, and a tank commander, and he had a jeep full of soldiers all armed to the teeth, waiting to escort me from the airport to my home. It was quite a big shock. So I reported the following day to the to the defense ministry to take by my order. The following day again, I was already in uniform, back in the trenches, immediately back to the war with all the artillery booming around. But I was expecting all that, so I was no longer shocked. The first shock was the airport.
As an untrained soldier, what was your assignment?
I was sent back to a military base for retraining, and it was back to the war. Yes, it was back to the war. Soon after I reported to the base was under rocket attack. And I remember it was at night, I was sleeping on the upper bunk of a bunk bed, and suddenly I found myself on the floor. I was on the floor before I heard the remnant of a rocket explosion. The rocket exploded not far from my barracks. And in the morning, well, out of curiosity, I went to look over it was a big crater. We could put a house into the crater, but it was no joke. 2 of our airborne soldiers died in that attack. And then, of course, there were skirmishes all around the bases all the time. And by then, the first wave of the North Vietnamese offensive was over. I was back home in time for the second wave. The communists rallied and launched a second wave of attack. So I was in the second wave. And yes, dying happens all along. During the 6 months I was back in uniform. I would say about the last event when one day early in the morning, a unit from the base, not my unit, but a unit from the base, went out the back gate, to open a highway. And the North Vietnamese booby-trapped a claymore mine in front of the gate, and the mine went boom, and 9 of our soldiers died. That was a big trauma for me.
So you were with the military for 6 months. Were you serving as a lieutenant?
I was a second lieutenant. When I was assigned to psychological warfare, I was a first lieutenant.
Okay, so Yes, you were transferred to the much safer job of psychological warfare office. So, what was the atmosphere like there?
Uh, it was in Saigon, and it was not far from the Prime Minister's office. I was familiar with that neighborhood, and then it was a surprise to me because without my knowledge, I received the order to report to Psych War. Of course, I didn't say no. It was a safe job, a desk job. Uh, I was assigned to the GV programming section, and the atmosphere was just very calm. Everybody survived, and the psych warfare office was intact, no damage, nobody got hurt. So I think we were just glad to be survivors, really.
Mm. There was one major who was very poor. Was that at the psych
Yes,
office?
yes, yes. He was a very nice officer, quite old for that rank. He could have been a general by then, but he was still there, a desk officer, and he was so poor. He rode his bicycle every day to work, and one day he shot himself, and his suicide note said that he was too poor, he couldn't take it anymore, and I knew that he must be a very clean officer. He was not a corrupt officer. That's why he was so poor. That was a big trauma for me.
How did other people in the office react?
We didn't talk.
Mm.
We knew that we must not talk under certain circumstances, like under such circumstances, nobody talked.
Mm-hmm.
We kept quiet, but we murmured.